On a snowy day, March 29th, 1461, two armies faced down in the rolling fields outside the small village of Towton, near York in the fractured kingdom of England. This is the age of the Wars of the Roses at the end of the medieval period, and the crown of the Kingdom of England is up for grabs. By the end of this day, according to the heralds, 28,000 human bodies would litter the battlefield. Killed mercilessly as before the battle began, no quarter was to be given nor received by either side. This is the Battle of Towton, the bloodiest battle on English soil. And in this video, we will take a brief look at the events that surround this bloody and sorry affair. The story that leads up to the Battle of Towton is one of many chapters, and the battle itself is but a bloody start of the next chapter in the story of the Wars of the Roses. However, the story more or less begins with the removal of Richard II by Henry Bolingbroke, the future Henry IV, marking the end of the French-speaking reign of Norman Plantagenet kings. Henry Bolingbroke is a Lancastrian. Henry IV has a son, Henry V, the famous King of England, who takes an arrow to the face at the Battle of Shrewsbury and defeats a French army at the Battle of Agincourt. The resulting peace terms with the French end with Henry V being married to the daughter of the French king, Catherine of Valois. An important note to make is that the French monarch, King Charles VI, who suffered from a mental illness giving him bouts of madness and famously believing he was made of glass. It is possible that this condition is genetic, as we'll find out later. Nevertheless, Henry and Catherine had a son, the future Henry VI. When Henry VI became king, it was clear that he had some sort of mental illness. He is known as the Mad King of England. After losing the last English holding to the French, Henry fell into a catatonic stupor. Henry VI was married to Margaret of Anjou, a woman of strong will and ambition, unlike her husband who was weak of will and constitution. And here steps in Richard, Duke of York. Needless to say, he was the House of York, and a claimant to the throne of England. Richard Plantagenet fought in the dying moments of the 100 Years' War against France. With an army, Richard performed some successful actions against the French army, led by the French king Charles VII, helping to lift the siege of Pontoise. However, the French would return to take Pontoise, and later Richard would go on to govern Ireland and develop a burning hatred for Edmund Beaufort, Duke of Somerset. More so when the last holdings in France were lost to the French, and Richard deemed the Duke of Somerset at fault for the disasters. Now, throw in the lack of will and constitution of Henry VI, the ambition of Margaret Anjou, and her power through the hands of Duke of Somerset, you have a boiling cauldron of blood feuds, desire for control, and lack of authority. Now that we have taken a brief look at the two main houses in the Plantagenet dynasty, and a little look at some of the events that prelude the Wars of the Roses, now we can take a brief overview of the events at the start of the first series of hostilities. This is the road to the Battle of St. Albans, and the death of Richard, Duke of York. After the Duke of York's return to England and Henry VI's fall into the catatonic stupor, two dangerous factions emerged, Margaret of Anjou and Somerset in one corner, Richard of York and Earl of Warwick, Richard Neville, in the other. The events put broadly and simply, once Henry VI fell into his torpid state, Richard of York was established as Lord Protector of the realm of England with the help of the Earl of Warwick, removing Somerset from power and with him any semblance of power that Margaret held. Once Henry recovered from his stupor, Somerset was back in power and a return of Margaret's power play. This is what the situation has become, two ambitious and strong-willed characters vying for control and destabilising an already shaky state. Ultimately, both sides came to a head at a Battle of St. Albans. Somerset, with King Henry in his custody, met the Duke of York and Earl of Warwick at St. Albans. The battle was a victory for the Yorkists. Henry fell into the Yorkist custody and Somerset met his end in the fighting. This was the bloody opening stage of the Wars of the Roses. After the Battle of St. Albans, there's a short period of relative peace. Henry still serving as king, but Richard of York restored to the role of Lord Protector. However, after the Battle of St. Albans and the reinstallment of the Duke of York as Lord Protector, Richard made moves to make himself and his bloodline the heirs to the throne of England after Henry passes on, effectively disinheriting Henry's son to the line of succession. Margaret of Anjou was not content in staying idle and let this happen, Using her influence, she raised an army in rebellion. Richard marched out to meet her in battle, culminating with the Battle of Wakefield, where the Duke of York was ambushed and was slain alongside with his eldest son. Here, the seeds of hatred are sown for the Duke of York's son, Edward, to take to the field and take vengeance on his father's death. Blood for blood. The two armies faced one another across the snowy, rolling fields between the two towns of Towton and Saxton. The Lancastrian army occupied a rise in the landscape just to the south of Towton itself, with the Cockbeck River and its steep bank to their right, with Castle Hill Wood covering part of that bank, and the moorland on their left, whilst the Yorkist army occupied a slightly higher rise further to the south, their position straddling the two main roads that lead through to Towton. In terms of the disposition of the armies, the Lancastrian army was led by Henry Beaufort, the Duke of Somerset, with around 30 to 35,000 men. Alongside the Duke of Somerset was the Earl of Northumberland, Sir Andrew Trollope, and Lord Dacre, each commanding their respective attachments. There was also a force of cavalry in Castle Hill Woods, waiting in ambush. On the other side of the battlefield, the Yorkists were led by Edward, Earl of March, who would lead around 30 to 40,000 men, a relatively equal force to the Lancastrians. Alongside Edward was the Earl of Warwick, Richard Neville, and Lord Falkenberg on the field, with the Duke of Norfolk a few hours' march away. Until Norfolk reaches the field of battle, the Yorkists will have a numerical inferiority. The weather was not ideal. There was a strong wind blowing up from the south, and this blew snow and bitter wind into the faces of the Lancastrians and would effectively blind them going into the opening phase of the battle. And speaking of opening phase, the day's fighting began with Lord Falkenberg moving his detachment forward and ordering his archers to let loose upon the Lancastrian line. The Lancastrians returned in kind, but loosing arrows practically blind and into the wind put them at a disadvantage and inflicted minimal damage, as most of their arrows did not reach their targets. The opposite effect was working with the Yorkists' favour. The wind carrying their arrows downrange. It is even said that some of the arrows shot at the Lancastrians that day were Lancastrian ammunition that was being shot back at them by the Yorkists. After the arrow exchange, the Lancastrian army marched forward to commence battle proper. The two armies clashed and the fighting was bloody, and the mass grave found a few decades ago, full some of the individuals who fell that day, show all the hallmarks of a violent death, ranging from multiple blows to the face and head, typical defensive wounds to the arms, hands and fingers, and so forth. I'll link a video to a documentary on the subject of the dead found at Towton. The situation for the Yorkists, however, started to turn against Edward, as the Lancastrian cavalry hidden in Castle Hill Woods made a charge into Yorkist flank. The Yorkists felt the pressure and gave ground. As the day grew late, and the Yorkist position under even more pressure, the Duke of Norfolk and his force finally arrived on the field. Advancing straight into Lancastrian flank, this was a pivotal moment in the battle, as Norfolk's timely arrival turned the tide into the Yorkists' favour, and eventually the Lancastrian army started to waver, then break. Many of the Lancastrians attempted to flee across the Cockbeck, many being cut down by the pursuing Yorkists as they made their way to the river. Indeed, many who made it to the Cockbeck River were promptly killed or drowned as they tried to cross. The heralds of the day claim around 28,000 men were killed, and so ends the Battle of Towton. Put briefly, after the Battle of Towton, Edward, Earl of March, was proclaimed King of England, and Richard, Earl of Warwick, gained the title of Kingmaker. Henry VI and Margaret of Anjou, with their son, fled to Scotland. Later, Henry would make his way back into England and promptly arrested, and later murdered, after the Earl of Warwick changed his sides and Henry restored as king and then deposed a second time by resurgent and vengeful Edward. But in the aftermath of the battle and after Edward was made King of England, he went on a campaign of reconciliation and forgiveness to those who fought against him. For better or worse, as this may have been naive of the young king, and as hinted earlier, the Earl of Warwick would later change sides, falling out of favour with Edward, largely over a matter of marriage. Richard was sent to France to arrange a marriage for Edward. However, while he was over in France, Edward had other ideas and got himself married anyway to Elizabeth Woodville. Upon Richard's return, safe to say he was not pleased about the whole affair and felt a bit slighted. Hence his eventual jump ship to the other side, which would restart the Wars of the Roses. Edward would later fall ill and die, leaving the Woodville family largely in control of his children, his brother Richard as regent, though Richard would then go on to become king and not Edward's eldest son, whom would disappear along with his younger brother, the famous Princes in the Tower. Richard's reign was the last phase of the Wars of the Roses, as his reign and that of the entire Plantagenet dynasty would come to an end at the Battle of Bosworth Field, where Richard would be cut down by Henry Tudor, the first Tudor king of England. Well then, that was my attempt in telling the story of the Battle of Towton with a brief look at the Wars of the Roses. It is thanks to the series done by Dan Jones that gifted me the interest in medieval England around the time of the Wars of the Roses. I plan on visiting this very field that the battle took place at some point in the future, and I'll certainly post that on my community tab when I do so. This video is long overdue. I originally planned to make this and release this video on the anniversary of the battle. However, life got in the way. I did the research and produced this video, so any mistakes on my own. Thank you for watching, and I hope to see you in the next one.